I went to prison at a young age because my mom would be gone 3 and 4 days at a time, and old men would try to. I learned the ways of the streets and protected my family as much as I could until I got busted. And I was only 15 when I got busted, so.
On today's video, HUD claims that systematic racism is leading to a disproportionate amount of African Americans ending up homeless. A news agency out of Texas claims that the African American homeless population has increased dramatically there. HUD claims that 40% of the homeless population is currently African American and 22% of the homeless population is Hispanic. I've seen homelessness all over the United States, and I don't believe that's possible. HUD also claims that a surge in migrants is one of the reasons why more people are ending up homeless. HUD also claims that the effects of systematic racism have stretched homeless services. Another news report claims that African Americans are 6 times more likely than others to experience homelessness. So the effects of racism on the homeless population are starting to become evident. And it would probably be about time that somebody who actually knows what they're talking about fills in on this topic, and that's why I'm here today. I have to say that analytics on homelessness are absolutely unreliable. For one, people who are homeless may not even let their employer know they're homeless for fear of being fired. You may have noticed that in some of my recent interviews, some of the people that I interview are wearing masks, and it isn't because they have warrants, it's because they have jobs out in the public and they're afraid that if their workers or the customers knew they were homeless, they could lose their jobs. The leading causes of homelessness, without a doubt, are addiction, and addiction disproportionately affects the white population more than other races. For example, here in the state of Florida, whites are more than 2 times as likely to overdose than blacks or Hispanics. Therefore, a larger percentage of the homeless white population is in that situation by choice versus African Americans. Many of them are not there by choice. They're there because of actual systematic racism. You really have to understand the causes of homelessness are not directly related to economy and incomes and jobs. It's a much more complicated issue. So to just correlate racism based on incomes with homelessness, you're missing out on a lot of the picture. Many of the traits that homeless people share in common, like addiction, like being in the foster care system, but there's also distinct differences in the composition of the African American homeless population versus that of the white homeless population. But resoundingly, if the white population consumes and is addicted at significantly higher rates than African Americans, we can assume that the white population that is homeless is there by choice much more often than African Americans, for example. Then comes the fact that people are much more sympathetic to certain demographics that are homeless, in particular females that are young and white. Many people will offer them help out of homelessness or be much more understanding of their homeless state than, let's say, an older African American male. Society in general simply doesn't give a crap about certain demographics of homelessness. In many cases, people may be more sympathetic for a white female who's homeless by choice due to addiction than they are to an African American who's been a victim of injustices. But now it seems that racism among the homeless population, or the effects of racism on the homeless, have become politicized, and they're mostly backed by agendas than they are over compassion. Then you're disregarding the fact that whites are just as likely to end up homeless because of racism as African Americans or Spanish. Take, for example, the case of a white person who marries somebody of a different race. These individuals are taken out of wills. They're disowned by their families. Let me share you guys a story of a white person who is homeless because of racism, clearly illustrating to us that even the white population can become homeless due to racism.
Put all my stuff in the dumpster. So now I'm living out of a bag. I got nowhere to stay except on the sidewalk. I've been on the streets now for almost, well, a little over a year and a couple of days. My brothers call me lover because I date outside my race. I don't care what they call me, I don't care. When you love somebody, you love them.
I'd be curious to know if when HUD does these studies on homelessness being affected by racism, if they even consider how many white people are homeless because of racism. To some people, the notion of people ending up homeless because of racism may seem far-fetched, but in reality, as I've done my documentaries of homeless people, it's actually fairly common. Making their family members pick between inheritance, being allowed to live on a property, have access to jobs, or a marriage mate. If you've been watching my YouTube channel, you may be aware of the fact that when me and my wife ended up homeless, it was directly because of racism. We had a property, we had everything paid off, and we had to flee from Alabama because of our interracial marriage. So we have personally experienced how somebody can become homeless because of racism, including a white person like my wife. Racism has done a lot of damage to the United States, and it isn't a surprise that some people even end up in a homeless state because of racial hate. Many times, people, even within their own families, hurt people to make sure that they don't have access to their family wealth and inheritances simply because of their stance on racism. And that just goes to show how much damage racism is causing to people in the United States, that people are ending up on the sidewalk homeless simply because of racism or because they refuse to conform to some type of handed-down family racist traditions that won't allow somebody of a different race to fall under the family's inheritances. A lot of people who are housed today would be instantly homeless if they were left to their own devices. The only reason many people are housed is because their family has prominence, owns properties, and is able to give them access to employment. The truth is that a considerable amount of people who consider themselves better than the homeless population, if they were left to start over from nothing without any family help, just with their own abilities, would instantly become homeless because they're able to have housing not because of their abilities or their skills, but simply because of their family prominence. I mean, in my case, the only reason me and my wife were able to be housed when we became homeless is because people in our family helped us get back on our feet. So if it wasn't for family, many of us would literally be homeless right now. We just don't know it. If you've watched my interviews, you may have noticed a lot of people become homeless after the death of a family member who was supplying their income. So while many people claim to be independent and rely on themselves, the truth is without our family structures, we many times would end up homeless. And that's an example of many people that we've interviewed on the streets is becoming homeless because they lose somebody in their family structure. Now, African Americans, while poor, tend to have larger families than the white population, and because of economical immobility, many times they're closer to their family members than the white population, who are more likely to disperse. Analytics on people who are moving to other places vary by race in different communities, and that means that many times African Americans, while more economically deprived, have more people they can fall back on. And of course, HUD itself has provided more housing for African Americans than anybody else. In my interviews, I've actually interviewed people who were denied housing because they weren't African American. I've also met people who were put in government housing in the state of Florida, but they chose to be homeless because of the racism that they faced. Being white in an African American dominated housing project made them a constant victim for crimes. And this isn't out of the realm. So of course, racism isn't just affecting African Americans. There's whites who are affected by racism and end up homeless, like the individuals who have been placed in government housing, but they choose to be homeless because they're constantly being victimized by African Americans in government housing. These are real stories that are on our channel. Of course, many people choose not to make those arguments very often because, as we know, in the United States, it's African Americans who historically have had the worst brunt of racism. And now they're even going as far as picking up a narrative of Republicans and saying that the reason many Americans are homeless is because of immigrants. Something that I have ran past several white homeless people, and they don't agree with that notion. So many people say that are not homeless, well, there's so many homeless people because immigrants are taking jobs or immigrants are raising the real estate prices and all the immigrants. But when we actually talk to white people who are homeless and we ask them about how the immigrant community affects their state of homelessness, they don't say that immigrants are hurting them. In fact, here's what they have to say. They're taking from people like us, not Americans, and giving it to somebody else. But you don't really look at it that way.
That's horseshit.
Yeah.
'Cause first of all, there ain't nobody that's supposed to be here unless you're an Indian, if you really want to think about it. So who the are you to say anything like that?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
So now even government agencies are starting to blame immigrants for the lack of housing and opportunities in the United States. However, when we've talked to people who are homeless in the state of Florida, for example, they always tell me that Spanish people are the most generous and the most helpful, that nobody helps the homeless population more than the migrant communities, even more than Americans. So we can see that when it comes to homelessness and racism, there's a few distorted narratives out there. One, that immigrants are leading to homelessness. Two, that only black people are victims of racism and end up homeless because of racism, when many whites are also ending up homeless because of racism. So it's sad to say that many people are using homelessness to further their own political ideologies and spread misinformation that they supposedly have analytics for, but in reality we know isn't true. Take the notion that 40% of the people that are homeless in the United States are African American. In what world are 40% of homeless people African American? I couldn't relate to that, and I've been to 37 states in the last few years. I've seen homelessness all over the United States, and well, who could actually agree with that notion? Even in majority black cities, disproportionately whites end up homeless more than other races. So again, we're starting to see people come into this idea of homelessness being affected by racism with preconceived ideologies that they're trying to prove. Ideologies like, for example, the idea of black jobs, the notion that migrants are taking jobs that would belong to African Americans. And well, there really isn't any nice way of saying this, but take here in the state of Florida, many of the jobs that immigrants do, whites, wealthy whites, wouldn't hire African Americans to do them. For example, house cleaning. They're not going to use African Americans for those occupations, and we know that. So this idea that black jobs are being taken by migrants, it simply doesn't match the reality. In fact, we've seen in states like Alabama, particularly the northern part of the state, where they have allowed immigrant communities to settle in places like Huntsville because they refuse to allow African Americans to fill those same positions. So we know for a fact that this black jobs notion simply isn't true. The whites that have those jobs don't want blacks to do those jobs. They're not going to hire black people to work certain jobs in certain places. Of course, one of the most interesting abnormalities that I have noted with racism and homelessness is the situation of Native Americans. See, here in Florida, I almost never met any Native Americans. They really are few of them here in the state. However, while doing my homeless interviews, I've ran into quite a handful of people who claim to be Native Americans, but they're homeless. Now, when somebody claims that they're Native American and they're homeless, you have to take it with a grain of salt, because we know the notion that that would imply that this land is all theirs to begin with. And as we know, the homeless people are susceptible to a lot of conspiracy theories and a lot of ideologies that are not exactly 100% credible. But it does seem like Native Americans are disproportionately more likely to end up homeless in the state of Florida. And the number of people that we have met and interviewed at homeless camps that claim to be Native American definitely seems alarming, considering how small of the population they are in general, but how often you run into people of Native American descent that are homeless. But then again, proportionally, Native Americans are more propense to addiction and alcoholism than a lot of other races. So at that point, it almost seems like a matter of choice, not of actual systematic racism. And this really poses an interesting question. When you look at the analytics of who is actually homeless, it's almost impossible to gather a round number, since homelessness is a very dysfunctional, disorganized, hidden, elaborately complex situation. So any conclusion that you draw based solely on analytics from homelessness need a question mark over them to begin with. But even then, with groups like Native Americans and whites who are proportionally more likely to end up with choices that lead them to homelessness, how can you possibly draw an accurate picture of the reasons why these individuals are homeless based simply on the number of percentages by race? To make things even more complicated, it is very common among the homeless population for people to have ideologies about racism in general, like this individual homeless person who gave us his personal view on race. Interestingly, individuals like him, despite being part of a Aryan Brotherhood, are actually on the streets sharing food with African Americans, because on the streets, once you become homeless, even if you have an Aryan Brotherhood tattoo on your leg, you might have to sleep next to a black person, share food and covering with them. And on the streets, I can say that overwhelmingly, I don't see examples of horrific acts of hate among the homeless towards each other. In fact, I see the complete opposite. I've seen people like this individual with an Aryan brother tattoo on his leg sharing a sandwich with somebody who's black. So it's very questionable how much of a role race plays into the state of homelessness. Perhaps individuals who become homeless have to pay attention to what neighborhood they live in, but beyond that, it doesn't seem like racism among the homeless population overrides the camaraderie of we're all in the streets together. This individual here spent a large portion of his life in the prison system, and that seems to be a common denominator among the homeless. It seems like that if there's 10 homeless people in one spot, if you put together how many years they all spent in prison, combined they might have 100 years altogether. Homelessness is synonymous with incarceration and being institutionalized, like this individual here who spent most of his life locked up, and that's very common among the homeless population. And we know African Americans are disproportionately more likely to be incarcerated than whites, in many cases a rate of as much as 2 times higher. So when you incarcerate people, it's almost synonymous with homelessness. So with being institutionalized, being so much entangled with homelessness, we can almost assume that the fact African Americans are more likely to be incarcerated would correlate with more homelessness. Now recently, Hispanics and blacks have become disproportionately more likely to become homeless than any other race. Take the case of Miami, Florida, for example. Many years back, most of the homeless people in Miami were predominantly of the white race, but now you're starting to see a lot of Hispanics enter homelessness in Miami, a large percentage of them individuals who are elderly and disabled. Now, seeing Hispanics, especially elderly Hispanics, homeless on the streets of Florida, particularly Miami, was practically unheard of, but now it's basically the norm. HUD will tell you that it's because of new arrivals, and I did encounter new arrivals that are homeless in Miami that haven't even learned English yet. These are individuals that recently came to the United States. They're here illegally and they're homeless on the streets of Miami. I didn't interview them because they speak Spanish, and well, I'm not going to do a Spanish interview for our channel. But it definitely does exist. It exists in Miami. It exists in San Antonio. These are people who are new arrivals and they come to the United States to be homeless because cost of living is almost impossible nowadays. In the past, when people came to the United States, they could go to affordable neighborhoods and find affordable housing, start working, and immediately be housed. But recently in the United States, affordable housing doesn't exist even in bad neighborhoods. So in cities like Miami and San Antonio, you're starting to see homeless that are new arrivals. But compared to the population of homelessness in general, they're a very small percentage. And then how does one person arriving to be homeless in the United States correlate with more Americans becoming homeless? It doesn't really correlate to anything. They don't have any economical impact on anything. It's just another person sitting on a sidewalk. It would be almost impossible to prove that that takes anything away from another homeless person. So that's not really a valid claim of any sort. And again, it's a very small percentage of people that are in that situation, and only in particular cities. But the notion exists that housing has got so expensive in cities like Miami, the lack of affordable housing is practically leading to a lot of people not being able to afford housing that previously could. So yes, you're starting to see a new demographic of Hispanics and blacks, elderly and disabled people who it's impossible for them with their age and their health to be able to afford housing if they don't have family, or if they have family, their family may not care for them. Now, in the past, it would have been a complete disgrace among the Cuban community to have somebody of your family sleeping on a sidewalk, but recently, the Cuban community has been divided because of politics, with many Cubans, despite being recent arrival, taking harsh stance on immigration themselves, like if they themselves weren't from another land. You got Hispanics now that barely even speak English but are able to vote, voting for parties that are against immigration, leaving people even of their own household in a situation where they could soon be deported because of how their own family members voted. And it's this division amongst the Latino community that has led many Latinos just kind of in the same situation as the whites. Historically in the United States, Hispanics and blacks have had closer family ties. They look out for each other, they protect each other, but with the increasing cost of living and with people having their political ideologies matter more than their actual family, you're starting to now see a lot of Hispanics enter homelessness. But the real culprit here is the cost of housing and the fact that jobs are not keeping up with the cost of living, leaving many elderly Hispanics on the streets of Miami, something that you just simply didn't see before. Homelessness among the Hispanic population has grown considerably in Miami, and many of these individuals are not addicted. If there's one thing I noticed about the homeless population in Miami is that they aren't there because of their vices or their habits. They're on the streets simply because, well, they cannot afford housing, their family member refuses to help them, and they end up homeless because of cost of living. And again, family plays a huge role into preventing that an individual ends up on the streets. And African Americans with gentrification are seeing the same exact problem. So you have the African American community that makes less income, and Hispanics as well. And these communities are now more vulnerable to the cost of living because there's some individuals who are disabled, elderly, and a minority. And these individuals will never get placement in a job that will actually make them enough money to survive in today's economy. They're individuals that simply because of social prejudice on who they are, their age, or their racial demographics, could never actually have enough income to supplement the cost of living today, so they end up homeless. So part of the reason you're starting to see a lot more African Americans enter homelessness and Hispanics these days isn't because of the reasons that they're mentioning. The reality is that these are disadvantaged demographics by age, by race, and they simply cannot manage in today's economy. We recently interviewed Corey. He lives in Sarasota, Florida, and he was a victim of a car accident that left him injured, which led to his homelessness. Now, Corey was hit by somebody who was undocumented. Now, because of his personal life experience, it's understandable that he may feel that the reason why he is homeless is because of the narrative that we hear in the media. And I've been working with Corey a little bit to work the hate out of the equation. See, when somebody experiences a traumatic experience like that, of course, they're understandably going to feel a certain way. I experienced the same types of feelings when I had to leave Alabama because of racism. Now, Corey was really afraid to express his life story because he felt that he would be labeled as a racist for sharing that story. But me and him actually have a good relationship. We stay in touch, and it is true that many times people who experience some type of race-related trauma, they're going to be afraid to talk about it because they're going to be afraid of the notion of how it's going to be perceived. And many times people think that's only true of Hispanics or blacks, but again, the same thing can happen to whites. And I think it's very important to emphasize on today's video that anybody, regardless of their race, can be the victim of racism, or they can be the perpetrator, which leaves somebody else vulnerable, and then that person can start to gain resentment. In the case of whites, many people think that whites are only on the oppressing side, but I've seen in my lifetime that whites can be on any side of that. Many times people only view blacks as victims, and that is true in many situations, but I've also seen how blacks can be perpetrators as well many times. So it isn't good to generalize that whites are the oppressor, blacks are the victims. And when you start to see government agencies talk like this, it shows a huge level of ignorance to the fact that anybody can be a victim, including whites, and anybody can be a perpetrator, including Hispanics and blacks. So when you see an American or white person voice their concerns of the things they've dealt with from other races, you can't just label them a racist. Now you have to work with them and help them understand that not everybody who's a minority or black is against them. Perhaps inviting them to a family dinner, doing something to help them get over that traumatic experience that led them to that understanding. And these things can be worked out. But if individuals are afraid to talk about their experiences because of how it's going to be perceived by others, then it doesn't make things better. And we're in the situation now where if a white person wants to open up about their experiences, they're quickly labeled a racist. But if a Hispanic or a black person opens up about their racial experiences, it's automatically labeled as some type of wokeness. And neither one of those things are true. Anybody can experience racism or have trauma from those experiences, and they need love and help to help them come back to the rest of us, and not to go into ideologies or conspiracy theories or political ideologies and agendas that promote hate for that particular group that caused them that experience. So this is where we have to come in and help people who have experienced these situations to realize that, of course, not everybody's like that. Many people believe that immigrants are taking up housing and making life more difficult for U.S. citizens. My personal opinion, living in Southwest Florida, and that we are the fastest growing region in the country, is that the people who build the houses are mostly immigrants. Supply and demand, they contribute to a larger supply because they almost certainly always work in the construction industry. What has led to Southwest Florida growing so rapidly is the fact that we have the labor force. So the only reason Southwest Florida has been the fastest growing area in the United States now for many years is because we have access to the labor force that builds the new home construction. If they weren't here, we wouldn't have new home constructions, we wouldn't have growth. And a perfect example is really the African American community in Fort Myers. As African Americans have progressed into better neighborhoods, many neighborhoods that used to be African American today are becoming Hispanic. So the areas that were Hispanic turn black, and the areas that were black turn Hispanic. As Hispanics are filling up the void left behind, the African American community has moved into areas like Lehigh Acres that are a little bit better. Many African Americans have moved into Cape Coral, and the void left behind in those African American neighborhoods, which are the poorest, that is being filled in by Hispanics. So we've seen even here where Hispanics are the majority over the African Americans, where African Americans, simply by having the English language, have been able to progress, while left behind are Hispanic and immigrant communities in neighborhoods that are in worse condition. And that's including the fact that along coastal communities, many of the ultra elite wealthy will not allow blacks to work in those areas. Those jobs are precisely for Hispanics. But even then, African Americans have been able to improve their conditions in Southwest Florida, move into better areas. So even here, where Hispanics are the majority over African Americans, you haven't seen this notion of black jobs disappearing because of Hispanics. You have seen African Americans take jobs in services, areas that require the English language. Perhaps they're not the best paying jobs, but they are getting these jobs. We recently had an arrest in Fort Myers Beach, which is the wealthy white area. These 3 black guys from Fort Myers went to Fort Myers Beach to rob rich white people, which is a horrible thing, but at least they're not victimizing their own community. While it was an awfully stupid thing for them to go and rob rich white people on the beach, it at least is better than victimizing your own community. And what happens many times with communities that are deprived is that you turn in against your own community. You start to victimize your own people. You start to hurt your own people, but nobody ever crosses the racial line and retaliates criminally against the other race, which is the bigger oppressor. So it's very interesting to see that in Fort Myers, it isn't just about, oh, let's victimize our own community and hurt each other. People actually go across the racial line and go hit the rich people up, which, again, it's completely horrible and wrong to do. But you're starting to see that, at least in the Fort Myers area. You don't have this cowardly thing like in other cities where people go and target the weak, target the minorities, target the vulnerable. If you want to be a thug in Fort Myers, you got to go do some brave stuff, not some cowardly stuff. And racial tensions are a huge problem in Fort Myers because, unfortunately, the white law enforcement has been the agitator in trying to get these communities to turn on each other. Some of the practices of Lee County and Fort Myers police departments are having, for example, a Cuban police officer patrol a Guatemalan neighborhood or a Guatemalan police officer patrolling a Cuban area, vice versa. And they do that to say, well, we have Hispanic officers patrolling Hispanic areas, but in reality, there are different Hispanic groups that are antagonistic to each other now because of law enforcement using individuals to patrol other communities. And law enforcement has really played a really nasty game in perpetrating hate in Fort Myers, but the people in general aren't like that. So there's a really nasty mix happening in Fort Myers now. And how does homelessness play into all this? We know that predominantly white users, white homeless, but the dealers are almost always black. And that seems to be a thing everywhere. And a lot of people don't like it when you say that, but it's the reality of homelessness. The white user, the black dealer, that isn't a stereotype. That's a reality. And sometimes things don't sound pretty, but you have to say them. Many people in the white community feel that Hispanics and blacks have been poisoning the white people with the substances. But you have to also consider that consumption is a choice. So how can you blame somebody else for your choices? If you didn't do it, you wouldn't be a user. So many times people like to point a finger at somebody else and say, well, these people are bringing it in and these people are selling it to us and it's their fault that we're in this state. And I have actually encountered homeless people who tell me that, black people are selling them stuff or Hispanics are bringing it in. And it's, how can you blame somebody else for your choice? You're the one that's choosing to consume the substances. And once people lose a couple people to overdoses, then they get mad and say, well, now I've lost people because of this. And then they become even angrier, venting their loss over a loved family member or friend at another racial group because they feel that those groups are responsible for your own personal consumption. But the reality of it is that many of the overdoses are caused not so much by what comes into the United States. It's the dealers here in the United States that are trying to cut this stuff. They're trying to make a bigger profit. And in Fort Myers, this has been a huge problem. Not just recently. This has always been a problem in Fort Myers, that there's too many dealers who step on the work. In other words, the work comes in clean. They want to stretch it so far. They want to make such a large profit by putting out a contaminated product that they cut it. Somebody buys it from somebody and then they cut it again. And sometimes in Fort Myers, by the time the product gets to the hand of the user, it's been stepped on 3 or 4 times. In fact, if you go all the way back to the Pitbull, way back in the early 2000s, Pitbull talked about how many times if you're getting it from certain groups, it's not stepped on. And there's individuals who step on the work. And by the time it reaches the user on the street corner, it's been stepped on several times. And by then, it isn't even the product. It's more like poison. So a lot of people forget that this product that's coming into the United States is coming in from a laboratory in another country that is a pure product. It's the dealers here in the United States to stretch the work, cut it several times, and that is what actually leads to many of the overdoses. It's the impurities that are in these products because the dealers keep stepping on it, adding cockroach killer to it, adding rodent killer to it. You wouldn't believe how many times people will step on the work before it hits the user on the streets. And this has been a huge problem in the city of Fort Myers, for example, where many times the dealers contaminate the product, and by the time it gets to the user, it's a complete bowl of poison. But again, if you were not purchasing illegal substances, you wouldn't be in that victim role to begin with. Over 100,000 people are dying in the United States every year because of addiction. About 7,000 of those people here in the state of Florida. And many people, when they lose a family member because of addiction, they want to go ahead and blame Mexicans, for example, where they're the ones that are bringing it in over here. But they're bringing in a pure product from a laboratory in Mexico with precursors directly from China. It's no different than what you get at a pharmacy. It's the same exact thing. It's the dealers trying to stretch the work in Fort Myers that actually led to your family member overdosing with the concoction that they brewed to make extra money off every single dosage they sell. But understandably, 100,000 people dying every single year in the United States because of overdoses, a lot of that affecting the homeless population, has led a lot of people to feel resentful over the issue because they've lost family members, blaming it on other nationalities bringing in this stuff. But keep in mind that it's the law enforcement that's been oppressing these individuals economically, which puts them in the economical situation that they're in, which in turn forces them to do whatever it takes to make more money, including poisoning the work. And again, they're put in these situations because as African Americans, they don't have the same economical ability as other people. I'm not justifying that. You shouldn't do things wrong simply because somebody else is treated wrong. That doesn't excuse bad behavior. I'm not excusing bad behavior, but it is important for us to understand that individuals who are economically deprived in the United States do find themselves in these situations more often. And then when you lose a family member because of their own choices, you want to blame them. But to be fair, your family member by choice decided to be a user. Those people that are doing that didn't have a choice. They were deprived economically. And well, they did have a choice, but they chose that, unfortunately. So choices versus necessity. You have somebody who's in a situation they probably wouldn't want to be in, or they're in a predicament where if they had better opportunities, perhaps they wouldn't be in that position. So you can't blame somebody for their economical position because of your choices. And that's a lot for somebody to absorb who's dealt with losing somebody to an overdose. But you can't solely base the fact that you lost a family member 100% responsibility on other races that are selling or bringing this stuff in when your family member made the choice to do it voluntarily. And it's really sad to see that with this 100,000 deaths a year in the United States because of overdoses, how racism plays a role. Because against the white population is more propense to be a user. Hispanics are clearly more propense to be the ones bringing it in, and African Americans are the ones selling it and many times cutting this stuff, making it more dangerous. But some people are in that position by choice. I think everybody's really in that position by choice because no matter how bad things get, you should never resort to crime. And no matter whatever you're going through, you should never resort to addiction to deal with your ailments. So nobody here is really a victim. Everybody here is involved and guilty in some form of another, so you can't blame other people when you're complicit. If you're a user, you're complicit. You're part of the food chain. But just like the man that we met in Georgia who was disowned by his family because he had a black girlfriend, we love who we love, and many times we're willing to give up family properties and inheritances to be who we are, to love who we love. So while there's definitely examples of hate out there, there's examples like this gentleman who followed his heart, did what he felt was right, has done what he feels is right, and even though it's left him in a very vulnerable position, society does punish people for doing the right thing. I think this individual here in Georgia, if you watch this video on our YouTube channel, it's a perfect example of somebody who has had to pay the price for doing what he wants, for loving who he loves. After all, people are willing to lose everything they have materially to be with the people that they love. And love sees no race, love sees no color. And even when society tries to punish people for their decisions, those people are happy with their decisions because love is still more powerful than hate. And many of the people who are homeless because of racial issues are not exactly because they were discriminated for their race or systematic oppression, but they're being punished for the fact that they don't follow society's rules of racism. I really don't see HUD helping a white person get housing because they married a black person, for example. That doesn't match their narrative. And unfortunately, the situation with homelessness in the United States is now being politicized in a lot of ways. And many of the rhetoric we're seeing from politicians is working its way into how we look at the homeless population. And this really isn't a justifiable situation. It isn't going to help people who are actual victims of racism. What it's actually going to do is that it's going to continue to perpetrate ideas that have already caused a lot of damage in other sectors of our society. When you become homeless, you're no longer the white race or the black race, you're the homeless race. So while these agencies are now trying to perpetrate that they are not being racist in general and they care about black people that are becoming homeless, the homeless race itself is discriminated. Take a look at the situation that I had in the city of Tampa. I bought these homeless people sitting outside food with my money. They're paying customers. The business owner was okay with them being there. I paid for their food, but this police officer from the Hillsborough Police Department tried to get these homeless people to leave. He tried to convince the business owner that he needed to evict them, and the business owner was like, no, they're paying customers. And me as a customer was like, hey man, I'm paying for their food. What do you mean they can't be there? They're paying customers. But the homeless race is being discriminated. So this was a white police officer looking at these homeless people like they're less than him, not because of a racial issue, but because he feels that homeless people shouldn't have rights like going to a restaurant. So we used to talk about how black people couldn't go into white businesses back in the day. Like back in the day in Fort Myers Beach, African Americans couldn't go to Fort Myers Beach, okay? Because that was white only beaches. So are these not homeless only restaurants? Homeless people can't go to a restaurant now because they're homeless. So we're treating homeless people today the same way we used to treat black people back in the day, where it was black, the days of segregation. We're treating homeless people today the same way that blacks were treated in the days of segregation. Look, he called backup and they brought 4 more police cars simply because I tried to feed a homeless person. The business owner was okay with it. I paid for their meal. But the Tampa Police Department, Hillsborough County, decided that they need 4 police cars because a homeless person was eating at a restaurant, even though the business owner was okay with it and even though another customer, paid for it. So we're treating the homeless people today the same way we used to treat black people in the days of segregation, in the days of white only and black only sinks. And that's what we're trying to do to the homeless people. This is a white only bathroom or a not homeless only bathroom. We don't let homeless people use bathrooms. I mean, we're treating the homeless people today the same way that we used to treat black people in the days of segregation. So what has changed in the United States? The new race isn't black or white. The new race is homeless. Okay? If you're homeless, you don't have a race anymore. You're no longer white, black, or Hispanic. If you're homeless, you're homeless. And the discrimination today in the police profiling isn't based around your nationality or race. It's based around the fact that if you're homeless, you don't have any rights anymore. Today, we're treating homeless people the same way we used to treat black people back in the day. So what difference is there today? There is no difference. It's just the way we treat other people is wrong. And while we think that society has progressed, nothing has changed. We still have slaves. We still have discrimination. It's just in a different idea. It's all wrapped around different notions. And in the state of Florida, you can't even convince people of what's right or wrong. You can actually get arrested just for standing up for somebody else's rights. So you guys remember back in the day we had black only and white only bathrooms? You have the same thing today. Homeless people can't just walk into a business and use their restroom because they're homeless, just like black people couldn't walk into a white restaurant in the days of segregation. Nothing has changed in the United States. The only thing that's changed now is who that victim is about this. But, he's not going to. He's not going to. That's right, man. He's not going to. Hey, it used to be black people. Now it's homeless people that discriminate. Hey, America ain't changed. Now they got a different person to go after. This bathroom is for non-homeless, just like this bathroom was for whites only back in the day. So you understand that the mentality of oppressing or looking down on other people hasn't changed in the United States. And now the homeless themselves are a race. So now they're trying to go in there and say, no, this is the black homeless, the white homeless. No. None of the homeless people have rights in this country. None of the homeless people in this country are being treated with due process. Now they're trying to get the homeless to turn on Hispanics. They're getting the homeless to turn on whites or on blacks. But the homeless are a race themselves. And they're in a situation similar to what African Americans were in, where they didn't have rights. I mean, really, if I can walk into a Walgreens and use their bathroom, why can't a homeless person do it? We're literally back in the days of segregation, except for now, instead of segregating people by race, we're segregating them by social economic class. This is the reality of the United States. And I know what I'm saying right now might sound strange to you, but we have become so desensitized to how we treat other people so badly that we're not aware that some of the practices that we're doing today in the year 2025 practically are the same practices that we look down on other people doing in the past. And it's the same thing. When you see a homeless person, you don't know if they are addicted. And even if they are, do you know how many people are addicted that live in houses? What difference is there between an addict in a house and an addict on the streets? I mean, it's the same exact problem. So We don't treat people who are addicted and housed any different. So why do we think it's okay to just generalize that all homeless people are addicted? And you know, it's really sad that the vast majority of homeless people are addicted, but that doesn't excuse now you treating them any different than anybody else. Because again, 10% of Americans are addicted. 10 to 15% of Americans are addicted in general. So are we going to start to go after those people too now? Obviously, they're breaking the law and they're going to have consequences one day from it, which could lead to homelessness. And a lot of people who are housed and then they get arrested and they become homeless because of these criminal charges, they feel indifferent to the homeless population. But you don't realize that if you're housed and you do things that are illegal, you are just one police encounter away from being homeless yourself. If you get into a car and drive in a vehicle, you can get into a car accident. You are one car accident away from being homeless yourself. And when you find yourself homeless, you find that your family disowns you for being homeless. You find that your friends don't want to talk to you. You find that your boss will fire you because you're homeless. Even though you're the same person you were before, it's just because you don't have a mailbox. Now people won't hire you because you're homeless. You can't use a bathroom because you're homeless. You can't get a job because you're homeless. You're practically in the same situation as a homeless person today as you were a black person in the 1800s in Alabama. So, well, I mean, Alabama hasn't changed too much itself. So the reality is that homelessness as a whole is one single race of people. And when they find themselves on the streets, that's why we see people with a freaking white brotherhood tattoo and he's on the streets sharing his last sandwich with a black person, because he's realized that his race is no longer black or white. His race is homelessness, the homeless race, a race that continues to grow in the United States and a race that has less rights than all the other races. The struggles of blacks are serious, the struggles of Hispanics are serious, but the struggles of the homeless race are innumerable, and the injustices that they are facing are uncountable. And now they're becoming a political puppet as well for people who have never lived in homelessness, have never been around the homeless population, become opinionated about the situation of homeless people, even though it's based off of their prejudice of driving by the highway and seeing somebody panhandling, but they've never shook that person's hand. They've never sat there and listened to those people's stories. And if you knew some of these people's stories, perhaps you would almost understand why they do the things they do. Many of these females that are out there, if you heard their stories, who did these things to them, the people you would least expect. If you understood the trauma that these people have gone through on the streets, perhaps you would be more compassionate to the situation they're in. But most people judge and don't understand. They don't want to take on the accountability of understanding the reality of these situations, because then they would be compelled to act. So yes, Hispanics and blacks are now entering homelessness at a larger rate than before. It isn't because of systematic racism. It is because housing has become so expensive that even poor neighborhoods where blacks and Hispanics used to reside are now unobtainable to many. And that means that a new vulnerable population is being exposed. The elderly, the people who've worked their entire lives, and today what they receive in benefits isn't enough for housing and subsistence, which means that many people are choosing to be homeless because they can't starve in an apartment. They may have enough money for one, but not enough money for both. When these elderly people become homeless, they immediately start getting victimized by criminals on the streets, and we drive by and think nothing of it. It's the lack of action from people like me and you, lack of interest and care, and the same politicians and agencies who have done absolutely nothing for the homeless are now talking about homelessness because it fits their political narrative of anti-Hispanic or anti-immigrant speech. Or these agencies now that want to get more funding from the government are saying that the government has to give them more money for public housing because now there's more discrimination. But in reality, all of these agencies are complicit in the mishandling of the situation in general. They're trying to put a finger of blame on somebody else for the things that they themselves are responsible for. I've been in this country from California to Florida, from Maine to Key West. I've seen 37 states. They have this political narrative that homelessness is in California and in liberal states, But in reality, from one coast of the country to the other, red or blue, homelessness is rampant throughout the entirety of the United States. Many people just naturally assume that homelessness and crime is the worst in California because that's all they've heard, and they've heard it repeated so many times that people now believe that California is this horrendous place. But in reality, from one coast to the other, regardless of the state's politics, homelessness is bad everywhere. It's bad in Florida, it's bad in California, it's bad in Maine, it's bad in Key West. From one point to the other of the country, homelessness is widespread. But now they're trying to grab homelessness and make it an agenda. They're making it a political point. But do not be misled. Homelessness is in every state, regardless if it's a Republican or a Democrat state. Homelessness exists in every part of the country, and it's just as bad in Florida as it is in California. Florida and California have the same exact problem, but we all believe that California's problem is so bad because we've heard it repeated so many times that we've come to believe it's true. But the situation here in Florida is just as bad as in California. But again, it's the same people who have done absolutely nothing for the homeless who are now using homelessness to try to prove their political ideologies when in fact they have done nothing to help the homeless. They want to make you believe that immigrants are the reason that there's homelessness, when if you ask a homeless person, out of all the people that are out there, who is the most generous? If you've watched my videos, you know the answer to this question. They always say that Spanish people are the ones who help them the most. And the rich people are the ones that look the other way the most. So it's the rich people now that are telling everybody how they should feel about homeless people and how they should treat homeless people and how we should grab homeless people and segregate them from society. But then we're hitting on the people who are actually doing the most for the homeless. And well, that's the reality of homelessness in the United States. I think that homeless are being treated the same way that people were being treated back in the days of segregation, where only certain people could drink out of this water fountain. And then you got all these people that sit there in the woods homeless and drink and get high all day and talk about all their conspiracy theories and all their ideologies, but they've never said they're not going to sit in the back of the bus. They never said they're going to drink from that fountain they're not supposed to. So again, the homeless people are filled with people who have ideologies, have conspiracy theories, but they don't actually do anything to actually progress their own rights. And nobody's going to come in here and do this for you. The homeless people in the United States, people got bills to pay, they got their own problems, and nobody's really able to help you because they're worried about their own problems in society. But it's interesting to see how many homeless people I meet have all these crazy ideologies, all these crazy ideas, but then none of them are actually implementing anything productive for their own fellow homeless people. But anyways, this whole thing about black or white homelessness is complete nonsense. If you're homeless, you don't have any rights. It doesn't matter if you're black, white. If you're homeless, you're homeless. It doesn't matter what race you are. You're now looked upon as undesirable in society, and you practically don't have any rights, like walking into a Walgreens to use their bathroom. I think by now people should start realizing that at any moment, just about anybody can enter a state of homelessness. It could be a car accident, a lawsuit, it could be a divorce, it could be the death of a family member. Any one of us could end up on the streets with nowhere to go. And when it happens to you, you're practically not going to believe it. I meet people that are homeless and they refuse to be called homeless. They refuse to accept the fact that they're homeless because they're in denial. They don't want to accept that the predicament of homelessness has happened to them. They feel like it couldn't be them. Their pride won't let them accept their reality. And that's the case for a lot of people that are homeless. They just don't want to accept that this is really who I am. They want to see themselves as they were before, but things can change overnight. So if you were housed, you got a nice place, and you're able to walk into a Walgreens to use their bathroom, that could all change tomorrow. Tomorrow you could be in line at a store and you can get kicked out for being the wrong race, the homeless race. I mean, it's true. You know, homeless people can't walk into a business. If the cops see you going into a business and you're homeless, they're just about to arrest you for trespassing. And that's exactly the type of horrific thing that used to happen in the past that they taught us in school was wrong. But it's the same exact behavior that our law enforcement agencies view as normal. So what we view as normal today and how we treat other people, and it's even the way the law handles people, isn't exactly correct. But it's the reality of living in the United States right now in the year 2025, where people are tripping up around black or white issues from the 1800s, but are blind to the injustices that are happening today in front of us on a daily basis. You know, they're caught up on stuff from 300 years ago, but they don't see the injustices that are happening today in their own neighborhoods, in their own communities. I find it interesting that they want to talk about race regarding homelessness when the things that are happening to the homeless today are no different than the racial issues we should have fixed decades ago. But it's interesting to me that these agencies would even get into the idea of inequality, racial inequality among the homeless. Go figure. Racial inequality among the homeless. That's really a topic for discussion today. But they overlook the biggest elephant in the room, that if you're homeless, you don't have rights to begin with, regardless of your race. And you guys, when I do these homeless interviews, I'm not stupid. I know the behaviors that these people are engaged in. When I interview people on the streets that are homeless, I know what they're engaged in. I'm a very respectful person when I interview these people. I give them a chance to tell their stories. I respect them. I give them the respect and dignity that nobody else gives these people. But I'm not stupid. I know the reality of homelessness. And every once in a while, you meet this guy right here from Cambodia who was 100% to the point about why he's homeless on the streets. He didn't beat around the bush. He didn't lie. He told us exactly what the issue was. But people like him that are honest are the rare exception. I know when I interview people, a lot of them are scammers. A lot of them are exaggerating their health condition. A lot of them are in denial about their state of addiction. I'm not stupid. I know by looking at somebody if they're engaging in something or not. But I give them the dignity and respect, the benefit of the doubt, you could call it, to get a decent, respectful interview out of them. But I'm not stupid. But I do love when I get individuals like this guy right here. He was one of my favorite interviews simply because of how honest he was about the situations he was dealing with and his causes of homelessness. And I'll end the video showing you part of that. He is Cambodian.
Yeah, that's what I did.
But
yeah.
I mean, obviously, today, right now, you are out here.
Yeah.
You know, that lifestyle does have consequences, right?
I'm waiting for my $1,800 to come so I can do the damn thing. Yeah, that's my favorite thing to do. Yes, sir.
Okay. So you just party and that's
sir.
it?
I party, brother.
All right.
I'm a party animal.
I got you, man.
Yes, sir.
Many of the homeless people that we meet are really afraid to talk about the reality of their situation and how they ended up there. There's always lies. There's always this roundabout. But every once in a while we get a person that's really honest and really tells us that, hey, this is the lifestyle I choose. I like the streets. This is what I do, man. Like this guy said, it's my favorite thing to do. It's an interesting interview because of how honest he was. But even people that are homeless can sometimes be in denial about how serious their situation is and what the causes that led them there were. For a few individuals, they tell me straight off the bat their traumatic experiences in the past, many times from family. When you hear these stories, without a doubt, you have to say, no wonder they're so hopeless. No wonder they're so desperate. Look at what they've lived through. Look at what they've been through. I couldn't imagine being in the same situation. So a lot of times we judge people for what they're doing or how they're living without understanding the reasons why they're there. You didn't go through being in that situation. You didn't go through foster care systems, different families. You have no idea the traumatic experiences that these people have been through that have put them in the situation they're in right now. We're not here to judge people. We're here to help each other. Systematic racism. You know, I think they're just sugarcoating something. The problem with how homeless people are treated in general is so bad that it's pathetic that somebody would try to make a systematic racism claim when homeless people today are being treated regardless of their race so bad. I feel like it's almost hypocritical to use words like systematic racism when you talk about homelessness, when the homeless people have absolutely no rights in the United States, regardless of their race. And what we're doing to the homeless people right now in the United States is the type of things people fought for during the civil rights movement, but nobody is even aware of how bad things have got with the homeless, because everybody's blinded by the ideologies that were getting thrown at us. And they want to turn the Hispanics against the blacks and the blacks against the whites and everybody against everybody. But when you become homeless, please believe it ain't going to matter if you're black, white. Every single person out there on the streets is family, because we're all in the same predicament. And it could be you tomorrow, so don't think you're too good to be out of this.